Good morning, afternoon, or evening. This is Deb. I'm going to do a little audio lecture, screen capture, going over the study guide for lecture exam 4, the endocrine system. Objective number 1 really ties in with objective number 11 down here. Way down here, you have describe the hormones produced by each lobe, anterior and posterior, of the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid glands, the pancreas, the adrenal gland, and the male and female gonads, including the target organs and action of each hormone. There are other hormones produced by the heart, the atrial natriuretic protein. You also have a couple of hormones produced by the kidneys. Remember renin and erythropoietin, and the gastrointestinal tract. Remember in the stomach and the small intestine, there are some endocrine glands, but those will not be on this exam. So that is number 11, and then let's go back to number 1. You can see this one is pretty much the same. It's just the major endocrine glands, the hormones they produce, and their functions. So let's go back down to number 11 here, because that one is in a little bit more detail, naming the glands. Okay, so this is pretty much near the end of part A of chapter 16 and going all the way through part B. We start out with the anterior and posterior pituitary. It talks about the 6 hormones from anterior pituitary and what their hormone is and what the target organ is. I could potentially give you a matching exercise, so that you would have to match the endocrine gland with the hormone that it produces, and or the hormone and its target tissue or organs. So be sure you pay attention to those things. So remember, in the pituitary, you have anterior lobe that produces those 6 different hormones. You know what they are. They are all listed for you. And then posterior lobe, which just produces there's 2 distinct clusters of neurons whose axonal endings form the posterior pituitary. One cluster produces oxytocin, and the other one ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Then the pineal gland. We didn't talk too much about that in class, but the pineal gland produces a product known as melatonin, and melatonin will control the sleep-wake cycle. Higher levels of melatonin in the blood will make you sleepy. And this functions under what we call a circadian rhythm, or a daily rhythm, so that typically we will sleep during the nighttime hours when it's dark and be awake in the daytime. They do believe that the sensory input through the eyes, of course, of light actually makes you more alert and inhibits that melatonin. Then we get to the thyroid gland. As you all know, there's a unit on the thyroid gland, produces thyroid hormone, T3 and T4. There's a diagram that actually represents how those hormones are produced by the thyroid. And then the target organs are throughout the entire body, particularly actually all the metabolizing body cells, and that the thyroid hormone controls basal metabolic rate, BMR. Then we have the parathyroid glands that produce parathyroid hormone, and parathyroid hormone will be released by the parathyroid glands when calcium blood levels drop. When your calcium blood level drops too low, or if it went too high, it can be very dangerous. So when your blood calcium level drops, we have actually a great reservoir of calcium in the bones, and it's locked up in the bones as calcium phosphate. So the parathyroid gland releases parathyroid hormone, which goes through the bloodstream to your bones, and it stimulates those little osteoclasts. Remember, osteoclasts will break down that bone tissue, and this will release the calcium into the blood, bringing that blood calcium level back into the normal range. Then we have the pancreas. Now, we talked about the pancreas with the digestive system because you do have those acinar cells which produce and secrete digestive enzymes and other material that goes into the duodenum through a duct. That's the exocrine portion. The reason the pancreas is an endocrine unit is because of the islets of Langerhans, or the pancreatic islets. These are these little clusters of cells. They look a little bit more lavender, a lighter color on the histology slide, if you'll remember looking at the pancreas histology slide. And these islet cells produce hormone. Some of them produce insulin, and the other ones produce glucagon. Insulin will be released when blood glucose levels go up. So when you're just absorbing some sugars into the bloodstream, it's going to target those cells, and then the pancreas releases insulin into the bloodstream. The insulin will target the body cells and actually allow the glucose to come out from the bloodstream into the body cells, thereby decreasing the blood level of glucose back to the normal range. And this glucose goes into the cells, and of course, if you'll remember with cellular respiration, the glucose, C6H12O6, plus oxygen, 6O2, that's going to break down the glucose into carbon dioxide and water and lots of ATP energy. If you are taking in more energy than you're using, however, the body cells are very effective at creating adipose tissue. So even though you're eating food that may be very low fat, if it's really high in sugar, the body can convert that into adipose tissue ad infinitum. But if your pancreas is functioning normally and your cells are not resistant to the effects of insulin, you will not have this chronic high blood pressure, blood glucose, which is defined as diabetes mellitus. Okay. The adrenal gland, remember those, that's actually each adrenal gland has two distinct regions. The inner region is the adrenal medulla, which produces adrenaline, or otherwise known as epinephrine and norepinephrine, or noradrenaline. And then the cortex, the adrenal cortex, has those three layers that produce corticosteroids. So these hormones, all of them from the adrenal cortex, these of course are lipid-based or cholesterol-based hormones. Remember, when they're fatty-based or lipid-based, they can go right through the cell membrane, that lipid cell membrane, and actually they can even go through the nuclear membrane and get right to your DNA to create changes in the cell that way. So the adrenal gland has those two regions with those hormones. Male gonad, of course, are the testes, and that hormone is testosterone that they produce, which has many target organs throughout the body. Female gonad is the ovary, and of course the ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone. And again, there are many target organs for these. We will talk about this in more depth with the reproductive system. So, know the target organs and the action of each of these hormones. These are all discussed from about halfway through Part A of Chapter 16 and then all the way through Part B. All right, so this one overlaps with that first objective. So let's go back up here. My cursor doesn't work very well. Let me move it like this. All right, so now we're on number 2. Distinguish paracrine and autocrine hormones from circulating hormones. Here's the answer right here. Paracrine and autocrine hormones, they are signaling substances, and they are secreted from specific body tissues into the bloodstream but then they act on the same cells. These would be called the autocrine cells, or other local areas, and that would be a paracrine. I actually discussed some of these when we were in the digestive system, so that the stomach, remember, had those enteroendocrine cells in the gastric pits. They would produce and secrete substances right into the bloodstream. One of the substances I talked about was gastrin from the G cells in the stomach, and it goes to the bloodstream, but then it acts locally right back on the stomach to increase the stomach motility, or the circulation, of the contractions of the smooth muscle of the stomach. So I also discussed some of the hormones that are secreted by the small intestine that went in. Those are also enteroendocrine cells, and they secrete some of those hormones that go into the bloodstream but don't go very far. They don't circulate throughout the body. They actually also affect the activity of the stomach. Remember, with CCK, cholecystokinin was secreted, and it would cause contractions of the gallbladder, etc. So I talked about those within other units, so I won't put them on this test. Okay, number 3, distinguish amino acid derivative and peptide or protein-based hormones from steroid-based hormones. If I say amino acid derivative, that just means it's one. We can also say they're, air quotes, protein-based, but of course amino acid is the building block for proteins. Amino acids peptide bond with one another, or they're linked together by peptide bonds to form peptides or chains of amino acids, and then as they get increase in complexity, they can form very large proteins. So there's a variety of sizes of protein-based hormones, but when they're built with protein, they cannot get through that cell membrane. So they have to act through what we call a second messenger system, where they bind to the target cell's cell membrane or plasma membrane, and then they will cause reactions in the cell through a second messenger. And that's when I use that analogy of the butler at the door. So the first messenger, would be the hormone traveling throughout the bloodstream, binds to the target cell, and then there are a lot of chemical reactions at the level of the cell membrane or the plasma membrane that will actually cause that second messenger to pass on the signal to the interior of the cell. Then we have steroid-based hormones. And remember, steroid-based hormones include only the adrenal cortex hormones. Those are all steroid-based or lipid-based. And then it also includes the gonadal hormones, such as testosterone in males, and then estrogen and progesterone in females. So those are all steroid-based hormones. All the other ones are protein-based. And with a steroid-based hormone, it can just go right through the plasma membrane into the cell, binds with the receptor within the cell in the cytoplasm, and then that will actually go right through the nuclear membranes into the nucleus, and will target the DNA at a gene region, and that's how it affects changes in that cell. Okay, 4. This is there's a great diagram in your lab module, actually, because remember, your lab practical number 4 includes the endocrine system. So I put in there a PowerPoint with just figures, and there's a great figure that actually has all 3 of these factors that will determine various hormones' blood levels. So define the 3 general factors that determine blood levels of hormones, and of course these are neural, humoral, and hormonal, and so that figure summarizes that. And I think it has humoral first, and then neural in the middle, and hormonal on the other side. And then describe about what happens with negative feedback systems in order to feed back to that original endocrine gland to keep things in balance. There are negative feedback systems involved with all of these because you want to be able to stimulate the release of a hormone to a certain point, and then when it gets too high, you need to turn that stimulus off to keep it within homeostasis. Number 5, here we have this diagram of a hormonal control of activity of the endocrine gland, an endocrine gland, or the blood level of that gland's hormone using the thyroid. You don't actually need to diagram it, but I want you to understand it. So be able to answer questions about the diagram. It's a nice summary showing an example of a hormonal control. That means a hormone controls the release of another hormone. In this example, it's thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, from the anterior pituitary, which will stimulate the thyroid gland to increase its production of T3 and T4. So take a look at that and understand what's going on. If you have questions about it, you can always email me. Okay, and that diagram's a PDF. I think it's a PDF. Anyway, it's either a PDF or a Word document. I wrote it in all caps, and it's you can print that out in your module for lecture exam 4. Then we have this one, number 6, diagram the second messenger mechanism of hormone action using the liver cell example. This one is another document in your Canvas module, and also that's written in caps. That one I do want you to memorize. Word for word, you will draw it out. There will be a blank page on the test for you to do this, unless you would like to come in at another time prior to the test and just draw it up, turn it in, and then at the time of the test you can just write "did it" with a smiley face on it. Okay, this is actually the answer to list the 6 steps of steroid hormone action. There actually, I think in your PowerPoint they only have 5. But anyway, this describes what happens when a steroid-based hormone is released and it reaches its target cell. A, the hormone enters the cell. B, the hormone binds with a protein receptor molecule. C, the hormone receptor, or HR molecule complex, enters the nucleus. The hormone receptor complex binds with the chromatin. Chromatin is actually DNA wrapped around little histones, we call them. They look like little spools. So chromatin is actually a DNA protein complex. But this is with your DNA, which is actually the instruction manual for building everything that cell needs. So this HR chromatin complex now will trigger little mRNA. This is messenger RNA, which carries a complementary copy of a gene region on the DNA. And remember, these are nucleotides. It could be many nucleotides long, but for every 3 nucleotide word, air quotes, I'm saying word, so for every 3 letters, it signals which amino acid is going to be pulled out from the cell's environment by a transfer RNA to be brought into place at the ribosome. So you have this messenger RNA, we call it a transcript because it's a transcript of that gene region. Now the so the HR chromatin complex triggers messenger RNA production, and then the 6th step here is the messenger RNA, which carries the code for specific proteins. It will carry this to the ribosome. So you can, word it however you want, but it's important to remember that this messenger RNA goes to the ribosome, where it will be read in these 3-letter words. They're called codons, and then that will be translated into the sequence of amino acids that are going to be brought together at the ribosome to build polypeptides. All right, that's that one. And it's pretty much the answer right here. So, 8. I really like this diagram. It pulls so many things together with the 2 control systems of the body, the nervous system and the endocrine system. Diagram the integration between the nervous system and the pituitary gland to indicate the importance of this in controlling other activities. This is the nursing mom example. So it's showing you central nervous system is involved because when the baby suckles the breast, or if the mother hears a baby crying, what's going to happen is that provides sensory input to the brain, starting with the cerebral cortex, and then, or if it's auditory over in that area, sensory input to the brain, then it goes to the hypothalamus. This will be sent both to the ant pit and posterior pituitary. When it goes to the ant pit, it's actually going to be sending actually a prolactin releasing factor to ant pit through that little capillary network that descends down the infundibulum. And so, but that's going to signal from the hypothalamus to ant pit to release prolactin. Now, prolactin goes into general circulation to the bloodstream, reaches the mammary glands, and then that is going to stimulate milk production by those mammary glands. At the same time, the hypothalamus directly from that cluster of cells that produces, or neurons that produces oxytocin, it will actually cause those cells whose axons are in the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. Oxytocin goes to the bloodstream, general circulation, and now this also reaches the mammary glands and will stimulate these little cells that are called myoepithelial cells. Myo refers to muscle. So these cells can actually contract to allow the milk to be released. They often refer to that as milk letdown. For successful breastfeeding, all of these things are required. Describe negative feedback as it relates to endocrine control and the maintenance of homeostasis. If you print out the diagram that shows the thyroid example, where it's showing, it's an example of a hormonal stimulus as to the production and release of hormone, it actually shows some negative feedback, and it would have the minus sign. When there's a plus, it indicates a stimulus, but there's a minus, it means it inhibits. And actually, during class, I pointed out, I would actually extend that line. Actually, I think it's right here. I would extend this line going all the way up to ant pit, because it will more, rather than just to the thyroid, this is representing the thyroid. When the level of thyroid hormone increases in the bloodstream, it's going to provide negative feedback to the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, which is actually saying right here, and that will tell them, stop making thyroid stimulating hormone. So therefore, that will be a form of what we call negative feedback, so that thyroid hormone level does not increase too high. And that is a great example of negative feedback. And this is true for hormones. If you stimulate them to be released, that will bring them up to the appropriate level. But if they get too high, that can be quite dangerous. All right, describe the composition, structure, and function of the pituitary gland, including the posterior and anterior lobes. Understand how the hypothalamus influences the activities or the production and secretion of hormones of each lobe. Now, remember that there was some differences between how the ant pit is stimulated and posterior pituitary. There are different types of tissues. Anterior pituitary is glandular epithelium. Posterior pituitary is actually true neural tissue, because in the posterior pituitary, remember, you had two clusters of neurons in the hypothalamus that send their axons and down through the infundibulum to the posterior pituitary, and the axonal endings are actually releasing into the bloodstream. And so now those two substances, oxytocin from one cluster of cells and the ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, from the other, these are released from actual neural axonal endings right into the bloodstream. Anterior pituitary is different, and yet it's still controlled by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus produces what are called stimulating hormones or inhibiting hormones. They used to call them stimulating factors or inhibiting factors. So for each of the 6 different anterior pituitary hormones, they will receive signals from the hypothalamus. These releasing factors, or we can call them releasing hormones, because they go into this little bitty capillary network system, and they're called capillary plexes, and they travel, this little network of capillaries travels down from the hypothalamus down to, through the infundibulum to the anterior pituitary at those specific locations where the cells are. And so we will have, and we call that the hypophyseal portal system. And so through that portal system, these stimulating hormones or inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus will either stimulate or inhibit the release of their respective anterior pituitary hormones. Okay, and this is just, I already went over this because with number 1, I directed you to number 11. It really is pretty much the same thing. Then number 12, compare the endocrine and nervous systems as the major control systems in the body. These are the major control systems, and remember, the endocrine system is typically thought of as longer term, slower reactions. But there are exceptions. If you think of adrenaline, for example, another word for adrenaline, of course, is epinephrine. That has an immediate effect on the body, because if you think about it, it's involved with the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system will stimulate the release of adrenaline, and that has to happen very rapidly, and it usually doesn't last a long time. Once you get over the fright, generally those levels will decrease. But there's also, most of the time, it's really long term. If you think about testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone, they create changes in the body that are going to be lasting for a long time. The nervous system is typically thought of as very quick and short term. So when a neuron releases its neurotransmitter, it's an immediate transfer and also response of the effector organs, such as the signals that are sent to your muscles to contract, etc. Or the other way around, like sensory input, it goes very quickly to your nervous system. But both of these are considered the major control systems in the body. I want you to start thinking about these a little bit, and many of the PowerPoint slides actually describe these. What would the hypothyroidism is low blood level of thyroid hormone. Hyperthyroidism, this, if you'll remember, this leads to Graves' disease. This is all described in your PowerPoint, and it tells what happens if you have really low blood thyroid hormone level or very high. Hyperparathyroidism, this would be when parathyroid hormone is very high in the blood. If you think about the effects of that, remember, you're going to have a lot more calcium being taken out from the bones. Then we've got your beta or alpha cells. All right, the beta cells produce insulin, alpha cells produce glucagon. These are the cells of the pancreatic islets. Both of these control blood level of glucose. So if you don't have enough insulin, your blood glucose stays very high. If you have too much insulin, or if you have too much insulin, will actually take the blood glucose out from the blood into the cells. But glucagon has the opposite effect. So glucagon reacts to low blood levels of glucose to start breaking down your energy stores like liver glycogen to release glucose into the bloodstream. And so if you don't have enough of glucagon, you can actually, your blood sugar can actually bottom out and you can die. So these are also discussed in those PowerPoint slides for chapter 16. If you have an abnormally high output of the hormone of the adrenal medulla, remember that's adrenaline or epinephrine. Think about if that was really, really high. Or if you have an increased output of the adrenal cortex hormones. any one of those three, think about what can happen. And I know that this is also discussed in the PowerPoint script and in your book. Anterior pituitary hormones. These are, there's 6 different kinds. Remember, about 4 of them are actually tropic hormones. That means they target another endocrine gland and will act on that to affect its production and secretion of hormone. Think about what would happen if your posterior pituitary failed. You wouldn't be making ADH or oxytocin. Oxytocin is a very specific action related to the reproductive system, but antidiuretic hormone, if you're not able to make that, that could be quite dangerous because you would not be able to reabsorb water, so you can become dehydrated. And I think we're right to the end, and that's it. Have a great day. I will see you in class.